I never could have imagined, not even in my wildest dreams, that at the age of 65, I would find myself staring at my only son's wedding invitation with my own name aggressively crossed out by a thick, angry black marker. For the past several months, Mark had been deliberately punishing me, making it clear that he was upset and disappointed because I had firmly refused his request to sell my home. He wanted the money from the sale to help fund what I considered to be an unreasonably extravagant wedding ceremony and reception for him and his fiancée Sarah. What he didn't know, couldn't possibly anticipate, was that on the very morning he was scheduled to walk down the aisle and marry her, I would receive a telephone call that would completely and irreversibly alter the course of both our lives forever. It was a call that would finally bring to light a painful truth, a significant secret that he had been carefully keeping hidden from everyone around him, including me. Before we delve further into the details of this story and revisit that difficult period, I'd love to hear from you. Please share in the comments where you are tuning in from today. And if this personal story resonates with you on any level, if it touches your heart or your own experiences, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. It would mean a great deal to me. Also, be sure to turn on notifications because tomorrow I have something truly extraordinary and deeply personal saved just for you, something I believe you won't want to miss. The wedding invitation sat there on the smooth surface of my worn kitchen table, a stark and beautiful piece of cream-colored cardstock. It was elegantly decorated with delicate gold embossing and formally announced the upcoming spring wedding of Mark and Sarah, scheduled to take place at the prestigious Oak Ridge estate. When it had first arrived in the mail approximately 3 months prior, I had felt a surge of maternal pride. I had proudly displayed it on the door of my refrigerator, using a small ceramic magnet shaped like a sunflower. Each morning as I went through my routine of making my usual cup of tea, I would gently run my fingers over the elegant raised lettering, feeling a sense of happiness and anticipation for my son's future. Now that beautiful symbol of impending joy was completely defaced. My name, Lily Sullivan, was violently scratched out, obliterated by that harsh black line. Right beside it, in Mark's familiar handwriting, was a cold cutting note that read, "Since you've chosen not to support our future, we've decided you shouldn't be present for its beginning." The words felt like a physical blow, a complete dismissal of my role in his life. As I looked around my kitchen, my gaze fell upon the familiar objects and spaces that held decades of my life. 30 years of cherished memories seemed to surround me within the walls of this modest 3-bedroom bungalow situated on a quiet tree-lined street called Maple Street. The bright yellow curtains that my late husband Bob had lovingly hung still framed the window situated directly above the kitchen sink, although the years of persistent sunlight filtering through had faded their original vibrant color significantly. Through that same window, I could easily see the small but well-tended garden that Bob had originally started so many years ago. The azaleas he had planted were now in full bloom, their fiery pink and red colors bursting forth in a stunning display. Their vibrant, cheerful presence offered a sharp and painful contrast to the heavy leaden feeling that had settled deep within my heart since receiving Mark's cruel note. I had been tending that garden completely alone for the past 12 years, ever since the sudden and unexpected heart attack that had taken Bob from us far too soon, leaving a void that could never be truly filled. Mark was our absolute miracle child, a precious gift born to us after 7 long and often heartbreaking years filled with demanding fertility treatments and countless soul-crushing disappointments. Bob and I had worked incredibly hard and saved diligently for many years specifically to afford the purchase of this house. We desperately wanted to provide a stable, loving home environment where our child could not only feel secure, but truly thrive. and grow into a good person. I could vividly recall the memories like they were yesterday. How Mark had learned to take his very first wobbly steps right there in our living room. His tiny hands gripping tightly onto the sturdy coffee table that Bob had skillfully crafted by hand from beautiful reclaimed oak wood. How this very kitchen had been filled with so much warmth and laughter during our traditional weekend pancake breakfasts. Flour dusting our faces and clothes as Bob patiently taught a young Mark the perfect technique for flipping a pancake onto the griddle. The backyard still bore the faint, faded chalk markings from Mark's ambitious architectural drawings. During his teenage years, his early imaginative designs etched into the concrete patio, where Bob had always encouraged his creativity and nurtured his budding passion. After Bob passed away when Mark was 24 years old, I had taken on double shifts as a dedicated registered nurse at Mercy Hospital to ensure that Mark could successfully complete his master's degree in architecture without being burdened by student loans, something Bob and I had always wanted for him. Those years felt like an exhausting blur of non-stop work. Coming home late at midnight, snatching only a few hours of sleep, then rising before dawn to be ready for the early morning shift. But seeing Mark graduate at the very top of his class, his face beaming with pride and accomplishment, had made every single sacrifice, every moment of exhaustion feel completely worthwhile. His very first professional commission, a small but significant renovation project for a local library, was commemorated in a photograph that still hung proudly in my hallway. It showed Mark and me arms comfortably around each other, his young face radiating with promise and the immense pride he felt in his achievement. When exactly had that grateful, sensitive young man I had raised transformed into someone who could treat his own mother with such blatant, callous disregard? The change, I realized with a heavy heart, had been subtle and gradual, almost imperceptible at first. As Mark's architecture firm began to find more and more success, he had started to move within increasingly exclusive and affluent social circles. His clothing became noticeably more expensive. His tastes in everything from food to furnishings became more refined, and his visits home to Maple Street became less and less frequent, shorter, and more rushed. Then 3 years ago, at the age of 36, he met Sarah at a lavish charity gala, where he had been one of the honorees for his work in designing a new, modern wing of the City Art Museum. Sarah Bradford, I soon learned, came from old money, her family name synonymous with wealth and influence, adorning buildings and institutions all across the city. At 32, she had already risen to become a partner at a highly prestigious marketing firm that specialized specifically in promoting luxury brands and high-end real estate developments. She was polished and sophisticated in a way that immediately made me acutely conscious of my own practical, comfortable clothes and my aging hands. Hands that bore the undeniable marks and calluses of a lifetime of honest hard work, both in the garden and at the hospital. Mother Mark had said during their first visit to my home, the unusually formal address immediately setting my nerves on edge, making me feel slightly uncomfortable and scrutinized. Sarah and I have some rather exciting news we'd like to share. They had chosen to announce their engagement over tea in my humble living room. Sarah's diamond ring, an enormous stone that seemed almost ostentatious to me, caught the afternoon light sparkling brilliantly as she extended her hand for my inspection. The size and flashiness of the ring seemed so at odds with the values of humility and practicality that I believed I had instilled in Mark throughout his life. "It's lovely," I had said, trying to be polite, though my genuine feeling was about the engagement itself, rather than the piece of jewelry. "I'm truly happy for you both." A fleeting flash of disappointment crossed Sarah's perfectly composed face, as if she had been expecting a much more effusive, perhaps even awestruck reaction and praise specifically for the ring, that I now recognize should have been my very first clear warning sign, a small crack in the facade. For several months following the engagement announcement, our relationship progressed cordially enough, but remained notably distant and somewhat strained. I received invitations to several tasteful, yet undeniably opulent engagement parties and gatherings where I felt conspicuously out of place and awkward among Sarah's friends with their expensive designer clothes, perfectly styled hair, and practiced, often superficial laughter. Mark seemed different in these settings as well, more reserved and less openly affectionate with me, seemingly more eager to impress Sarah's parents and their influential social circle than to connect with his own mother. The inevitable breaking point in our already fragile relationship came about 6 months ago during a dinner at Le Couteau, a French restaurant so incredibly expensive that I had to dip into my modest savings just to afford the cost of the meal. They had ordered a bottle of expensive champagne before dropping their bombshell. "We've secured Oak Ridge Estate for the ceremony," Sarah announced excitedly, pulling out her phone to show me photos of meticulously manicured gardens and a grand ornate ballroom. "It's where my parents held their 30th anniversary party. The waiting list is usually 2 years long, but Daddy pulled some very useful strings for us." How wonderful, I had said genuinely, trying to share in their obvious excitement, despite the heavy knot of dread and apprehension that was already forming deep in my stomach as they proceeded to detail their elaborate plans for a 5-course dinner for 300 invited guests, custom-designed floral arrangements that I knew would cost a fortune, and a renowned string quartet to provide music. "Mom," Mark had then said, his voice suddenly taking on a slightly hesitant, almost cajoling tone, one that I had unfortunately come to recognize as preceding a request for something significant or expensive. "The thing is, with the deposit already paid for Oak Ridge, plus the incredibly expensive honeymoon villa we want in Bali, and the substantial down payment we're saving for the penthouse apartment in Riverside Towers. What Mark is delicately trying to express—" Sarah smoothly interrupted, reaching across the table to lightly touch my hand with her own perfectly manicured fingers, her smile unwavering, "is that we really need your assistance to make this entire event happen in the proper fitting manner. Your charming house in this current market must be worth at least $450,000. If you were to consider selling it, you could live quite comfortably at Sunny Pines Senior Living, while simultaneously providing us with the necessary funds to start our married life together in the correct high society way." The sheer presumption behind their request stunned me into a moment of absolute speechless silence. They had already, without any consultation or input from me, researched the market value of my home, and even gone so far as to select a retirement facility where they envisioned me living. "I am not selling my home," I finally managed to say, my voice feeling distant and shaky as I gently but firmly withdrew my hand from Sarah's. "This is where Bob and I built our entire life together, where Mark grew up and has so many memories. My neighbors here are like extended family to me." Mark's face hardened visibly, taking on an expression of cold calculation that I had honestly never witnessed before. "This is precisely why I didn't want to even bring it up and ask her," he said directly to Sarah, completely ignoring my presence at the table as if I weren't sitting right there. "She has always been incredibly stubborn about this house, even though it's clearly far too much for her to manage and maintain alone now. I maintain it perfectly fine," I retorted, my voice tightening with a mix of hurt and indignation as I thought of the hours I spent tending the garden every single day, the small household repairs I had learned to handle myself out of necessity after Bob's death. And furthermore, I am absolutely not ready for a retirement home. It's not merely a home, Mother. It's a vibrant community. Sarah corrected me smoothly, her smile remaining fixed, but not quite reaching her eyes, which held a cold, calculating glint. It offers countless activities and provides opportunities to socialize with people your own age. You would undoubtedly be much happier there than rattling around alone in this outdated bungalow by yourself. What followed was a conversation that still made my chest ache, with a dull, lingering pain whenever I allowed myself to recall it. Mark accused me of being selfish, of clinging stubbornly to the past, and jeopardizing his future happiness and success. Sarah subtly suggested that my reluctance to sell the house was proof that I didn't truly care about Mark's happiness or his social standing within her family's influential circle. Either you provide us with the necessary funds to properly begin our lives together, Mark finally declared, his voice cold and final, or you should not expect to be a part of that life at all. The choice, Mom, is entirely yours. They left abruptly, after that leaving me sitting alone at the table, expected to pay the exorbitant bill for a meal I had barely touched, and a conversation that had broken my heart. For weeks I had desperately tried to mend the growing rift, calling, sending texts, even physically appearing at Mark's office, only to be politely turned away by an apologetic receptionist who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. Then, approximately 3 weeks ago, the defaced wedding invitation had arrived in the mail, a tangible official symbol of my exclusion from his life. That same evening, I sat alone on my old porch swing, watching as the setting sun painted the western sky in breathtaking watercolor hues of soft pink and vibrant orange. It was in that quiet moment that I made a difficult but resolute decision. Despite everything that had happened, despite the hurt and the rejection, I would attend the wedding, not with the intention of causing a scene or creating any disruption, but simply to be present to bear witness to the marriage of my only child, even if it meant observing from a distance, unseen and unwanted. I would sit quietly at the very back, holding space in my heart for the son I had raised and who, despite his hurtful actions, I still loved unconditionally. Mrs. Peterson, my kind neighbor from next door, waved cheerfully as she walked her energetic corgi named Biscuit along the sidewalk, calling out, "Beautiful evening, Lily." Her simple, genuine kindness nearly brought me to tears, a stark reminder of the warmth and connection I found in this neighborhood. This was my community, the place where I belonged, the place Bob and I had built our life. The thought of being uprooted and forced to move to a senior living facility simply to finance Mark and Sarah's lavish extravagance made my heart ache anew with a profound sense of loss and injustice. As darkness gradually settled over the quiet neighborhood, casting long shadows, I couldn't possibly have known, not in that moment, that the arrival of the morning of Mark's wedding day would bring with it a phone call that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my son's relationship and the woman he was preparing to marry. The week leading up to Mark's wedding passed by in an emotional blur, filled with a constant ebb and flow of conflicting emotions: hurt, anger, sadness, hope, and despair. Each morning, I awoke with the same hollow ache deep in my chest, the reality of my exclusion from such a significant event in my son's life hitting me anew with painful clarity. My hand would instinctively reach for my phone on the bedside table, hoping against all hope to see a message from Mark. Perhaps a heartfelt apology, a sudden reconsideration of his harsh stance, any small sign that he had softened his position or regretted his ultimatum. But the screen remained stubbornly blank, a silent testament to the distance that had grown between us. During those long, quiet days, I often found myself wandering aimlessly through the house, my fingers trailing over objects, that held a deep, tangible connection to my son's childhood. I would pause at the kitchen door frame, touching the faded pencil height markings that tracked his growth from a small 3-year-old up to a tall 16-year-old. I'd run my hand along the slightly crooked bookshelf that he and Bob had built together with so much laughter and effort for his 10th birthday. I'd look at the framed certificate from his first architectural competition, win in high school, a moment of such pure, unadulterated pride. Each of these cherished mementos told the story of a boy who had been loved deeply and unconditionally, a narrative that now felt increasingly disconnected and foreign from the man who had so coldly crossed my name off his wedding invitation. On Wednesday afternoon, seeking distraction and perhaps a connection to the past, I ventured into the attic, a dusty, seldom visited space that I had largely avoided since Bob's passing. Dust motes danced lazily in the weak shafts of light, filtering through the small, grimy window as I carefully navigated around stacks of boxes neatly labeled in Bob's precise, familiar handwriting: Christmas decorations, Mark's school projects, family photos, 1980s. I was searching for something specific, an object I hadn't looked at or touched in years. The large cedar chest tucked away in the far corner had been a thoughtful wedding gift from Bob's parents many years ago. I knelt beside it, my knees protesting against the bare hardwood floor, and with a soft groan, lifted the creaking lid. The familiar, comforting scent of cedar wood mingled with the delicate fragrance of dried lavender. Sachet enveloped me as I carefully moved aside the layers of preserved memories stored within my wedding dress, the white fabric now yellowed and fragile with age. Bob's military service medals polished but somehow diminished without him there to wear them. Soft baby blankets I couldn't bear to part with, long after Mark had outgrown them. At the very bottom of the chest lay what I had been seeking, a small leather-bound journal with a worn, cracked spine. Bob had started keeping this journal the very day we learned, after years of trying, that I was finally pregnant with Mark. He had filled its pages with his innermost thoughts about impending fatherhood, his hopes and dreams for our future child. After Bob died, I had placed it in the cedar chest, finding the raw emotions and future-looking entries too painful to read, but too precious to discard forever. Now I carried the journal downstairs, gripping it tightly to the sunroom that Bob had built as a beautiful surprise for my 50th birthday. I settled into the comfortable wicker chair where the late afternoon light streamed through the windows, creating a perfect, peaceful reading nook. With trembling fingers, I opened the journal, and the sight of Bob's familiar handwriting on the first page immediately brought tears to my eyes. April 15th, 1983. We're having a baby. After so many heartbreaking disappointments, it still doesn't feel entirely real. The doctor said everything looks perfectly good at 12 weeks. Lily was so incredibly pale during the appointment, gripping my hand so tightly, like she might just float away if she let go. I feel utterly terrified and wildly exhilarated all at once. What kind of father will I be? My own dad was so distant, so critical of everything. I want to be different for our child. I want our child to feel completely secure and safe in our love, to know deep down that they are more than enough exactly as they are. I turned the pages slowly, carefully, tracing Bob's handwritten journey from a nervous, uncertain, expectant father to a deeply devoted and loving dad. His immense pride in Mark was evident in every single entry, every observation. December 8th, 1983. Mark Bob Sullivan arrived at 3:42 this morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces of absolute perfect humanity. I've honestly never known love like this before in my life. I held him close against my chest, this tiny, fragile human being. Lily and I created together, and I promised him the world, everything good I could possibly give him. June 30th, 1987. Tommy built the most extraordinary complex tower with his wooden blocks today. He was so frustrated and tearful when it kept falling down, but he absolutely didn't give up. He just kept trying different approaches, different stacking methods, until he finally found one that actually worked. Lily says I'm probably reading too much deep meaning into a toddler's simple playtime, but I swear there is something genuinely special about the way his mind works, how he seems to intuitively see structure in space. September 5th, 1991, first day of second grade. Tommy was clearly nervous, but trying so hard not to show it to anyone. He reminds me so much of myself at that exact age, sensitive and introspective, but fiercely determined not to let anyone see his vulnerability. I need to make absolutely certain he knows it's okay to feel things deeply, that showing vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, but strength. Lily is much better than I am at drawing him out, at helping him express himself. She always seems to know precisely the right questions to ask. The entries continued throughout Mark's childhood and adolescence, faithfully capturing significant moments of triumph, small everyday joys, and quiet struggles. Bob's unwavering love and insightful observations provided a steady, loving witness to our son's gradual evolution into a young man. The final entries in the journal were written during Bob's last difficult months, when he knew his time with us was tragically limited. November 16th, 2011. Tommy graduated from university with honors today. His architectural models on display were absolutely the highlight of the entire exhibition. I was so physically weak from my illness, I nearly couldn't attend the ceremony, but I am profoundly glad I pushed through the pain and fatigue. The immense pride on Lily's face while watching our son walk across that stage. That's an image I want to carry with me forever when my time comes. She sacrificed so incredibly much for him, especially these past 2 challenging years during my illness. I worry deeply about them both after I'm gone. Tommy is so intensely focused on making his mark in the world, on achieving professional success, that he sometimes seems to miss what is truly fundamentally important in life. I desperately hope he realizes one day that his mother's unwavering, selfless support and unconditional love are worth infinitely more than any career achievement or public recognition. December 3rd, 2011. I asked Tommy to promise me he would look after Lily when I'm gone, when she's alone. He promised he would, tears streaming down his face. He is a good man at his very core, fundamentally decent, but he is ambitious in a way that neither Lily nor I ever truly were. I genuinely fear that ambition might potentially lead him to value the wrong things, to chase approval and validation from the wrong people who don't understand or appreciate what truly matters. I've tried my best to teach him that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, not in material possessions, but in love, in connection, in community, and most importantly, in living a life with integrity and kindness. I can only hope with all my heart that those essential lessons have taken deep root within him. By the time I gently closed the journal, twilight had fallen completely outside, and the tears that had silently streamed down my face had long since dried on my cheeks. Bob had seen it all, recognized the complex facets of our son's character, his underlying sensitivity, his sharp intelligence, his driving ambition, but also the potential shadow side, his vulnerability to external validation, his deep-seated desire to belong and be accepted among those he admired, regardless of their values. The very seeds of the painful conflict we now faced had been present even then, quietly noticed by a father whose observations were refreshingly unclouded by the sometimes blind devotion that I as a mother occasionally fell prey to. The following day, needing comfort and practical advice, I visited Beatrice, my closest and most trusted friend, since our demanding days together in nursing school. At 70 years old, Beatrice possessed a wonderful directness and no-nonsense approach that came from decades spent working in the high-pressure environment of emergency medicine, coupled with a deep well of wisdom that I had relied on consistently since Bob's death. Her small apartment was comfortably cluttered with fascinating mementos collected from her extensive travels. She had never married, choosing instead to dedicate much of her long career to working selflessly with Doctors Without Borders in various parts of the world. The comforting scent of chai tea filled her cozy kitchen as she patiently listened to my detailed, heartfelt explanation of my decision to attend Mark's wedding, despite the fact that I had been explicitly excluded. "Are you absolutely certain that's wise, Ellie?" she asked, her faded blue eyes clouded with genuine concern for me. "Mark and that woman of his could very well make a very public and embarrassing scene." "I simply need to be there. I explained gently, cupping the warm mug of tea between my hands, finding solace in its heat. "Not with any intention of disrupting anything, not to cause trouble, just to bear witness. He is my only child, B, the only son Bob and I had. How could I possibly not be present on his wedding day, even if he believes he doesn't want me there?" Beatrice studied my face intently for a long moment, her expression thoughtful and slightly resigned. "You've always had more grace than common sense," she finally said with a soft sigh, a hint of affection in her voice. "If you are truly determined to go through with this, at the very least, please let me drive you. I don't want you to have to face this difficult situation completely alone." Her immediate and unwavering offer of support brought fresh, unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you, B," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. That would honestly mean everything to me." "What on earth will you wear?" she asked, ever practical, immediately moving toward her overstuffed closet, already assessing her options. "You need to look dignified and composed, yet understated. Definitely nothing that screams, 'estranged, bitter mother of the groom.'" We spent the entire afternoon sorting through our combined wardrobes, a mix of practical nursing clothes and modest occasion wear, and finally settling on a lovely dove gray dress with a subtle, elegant silver thread woven through the fabric. It was refined and tasteful without being flashy, respectful of the occasion without being drab or mournful. Beatrice then loaned me a beautiful vintage single-strand pearl necklace to complete the ensemble, something she rarely wore. "There," she said, stepping back with a satisfied expression as I stood before her full-length mirror, looking at my reflection. "You look exactly like what you are, a woman of substance, depth, and heart, a woman who genuinely deserves so much better than she has been given in this situation." The night before the wedding, despite my exhaustion, I barely slept at all. A fierce spring storm rolled through the area just after midnight thunder, rattling the window panes of my old house, as if echoing the turbulent, anxious emotions swirling within me. By dawn, the heavy rain had mercifully cleared, leaving the world outside feeling washed clean, the air smelling fresh and fragrant. I rose early, long before the sun was fully up, and went to sit on the garden bench where Bob and I had shared countless morning coffees, discussing our days, our dreams, our worries. "I honestly don't know if I'm doing the right thing by going today," I whispered into the quiet morning air as if he could somehow hear me. "But I just can't bear the thought of not being there, even if Mark never even knows I came." I dressed carefully, taking my time, applying only a little light makeup to try and disguise the dark shadows of sleeplessness beneath my eyes. I fastened Beatrice's elegant pearls around my neck, their cool weight, a small comfort. At precisely 8:30 a.m., I heard Beatrice's familiar car pull into my driveway, her timing as reliable as ever. The wedding ceremony itself wasn't scheduled to begin until 11:00. But Oak Ridge Estate was located on the opposite side of the city, a significant drive, and we wanted to arrive early enough to slip into the back row, completely unnoticed by guests or ushers. I took one last lingering look around my beloved home before picking up my handbag. On the entryway table where I usually kept my keys and mail sat a small, neatly wrapped package, a wedding gift for Mark and Sarah that I had purchased weeks ago, though I had absolutely no expectation of actually being able to deliver it now. It contained an antique silver compass that had once belonged to Bob's grandfather, a symbolic gift meant to represent the importance of finding one's true direction and path in life. Inside the box, tucked carefully beneath the compass, I had placed a small card with a simple, heartfelt message. "May you always find your way home. With love, Mom." Just as my hand reached for the doorknob, ready to leave, the telephone rang its sudden sound, startling in the quiet house. I hesitated, glancing quickly at the clock on the wall. Beatrice was waiting patiently in her car. We needed to leave immediately to make it on time. The phone continued its insistent ringing. Something deep inside me, some strong instinct I couldn't readily explain, compelled me to answer it. "Hello," I said cautiously into the receiver, half expecting it to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. The voice that responded was female, unfamiliar to me, and clearly sounded distressed, almost frantic. "Is this Lily Sullivan, Mark Sullivan's mother?" "Yes," I replied, my heart beginning to pound with a sudden sense of unease. "Who is calling, please?" "My name is Rebecca Martin. We've never met before, but..." Her voice broke, catching on what sounded distinctly like a muffled sob. "I think there is something incredibly important that you absolutely need to know about your son's wedding, about Sarah. I honestly don't know who else I can possibly call right now." Through the window, I could see Beatrice checking her watch again, her expression indicating she was ready to whisk me away to a wedding that in that very moment suddenly felt infinitely more complicated and fraught with hidden meaning than it had just moments before. "I'm listening," I said quietly. Sinking into the chair beside the phone table, the antique compass gift, momentarily forgotten in my hand, as Rebecca began to speak her words gradually, painstakingly, unraveling everything I thought I knew about my son's relationship and the woman he was preparing to marry in less than 3 short hours. "I was Sarah's former roommate," Rebecca explained, her voice still trembling slightly, with residual fear or emotion. "We shared an apartment together for 2 years before she even met Mark. We were quite close, or at least I genuinely believed we were until..." She paused, seemingly trying to gather her courage and compose herself. I signaled through the window to Beatrice, giving her a small, urgent gesture that clearly indicated we would be delayed. Beatrice nodded understandingly and settled back into her car seat, patiently waiting. "Until what?" I prompted, gently needing her to continue needing to understand. "Until I discovered what she was truly like beneath the carefully constructed facade." Rebecca continued, her voice now stronger, more resolute. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you something very specific first. Did Mark or Sarah ever ask you to sell your home in order to help pay for their wedding?" The question landed like a physical blow, a punch to the gut. How on earth could this complete stranger possibly know about our private, painful family conflict? "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper, thick with shame and lingering hurt. "They did." Rebecca's bitter laugh held absolutely no humor, only pain and resignation. "That's her consistent pattern," she said flatly. "That's precisely why I felt compelled to call you today. You are not the first person, Mrs. Sullivan. Sarah has definitely done this before multiple times. My hand instinctively tightened its grip on the telephone receiver, my knuckles turning white. Done what exactly? I demanded, my voice gaining strength urgency flooding through me. Sarah Bradford has been engaged 3 separate times over the past 7 years. Rebecca stated plainly, recounting the shocking information. Each and every time she specifically targeted men who came from successful professional backgrounds but possessed limited personal or family wealth. Men whose parents happened to own property outright or had substantial retirement savings that could potentially be accessed. And each time she meticulously orchestrated a scenario where the parents were put under immense pressure to liquidate their assets, often selling their homes or using their life savings specifically to fund an incredibly extravagant, over-the-top wedding. I sank deeper into the chair, feeling lightheaded, my mind racing furiously, trying to process this unbelievable information. Are you suggesting that she is some kind of a con artist? I'm saying she is incredibly calculated and manipulative, Rebecca clarified, choosing her words carefully. The first time it happened with her fiancé, Michael, I honestly thought it might be a bizarre coincidence. Michael's parents sold their cherished vacation cabin, a place with years of family memories, specifically to pay for a ridiculously expensive wedding at the St. Regis Hotel. The engagement mysteriously ended just 2 weeks before the scheduled ceremony, after all the significant, non-refundable deposits had been paid to the venue and vendors, and crucially, after Michael's parents had already sold their property and handed over the funds. And the second time, I barely managed to formulate the question, my voice tight with apprehension. Daniel's mother, Rebecca continued, her voice heavy with regret, took out a reverse mortgage on her family home, putting her financial security at risk solely to fund their planned wedding at the Plaza Hotel. It was the exact same story. The engagement was broken off suddenly, right before the ceremony, but not before Sarah had managed to gain access to several joint accounts she and Daniel had opened together for wedding expenses and future funds. Rebecca paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing, her voice barely audible. In both previous cases, she walked away from the relationships with substantial sums of cash and expensive gifts, while the families were left utterly devastated, both financially ruined and emotionally broken. My heart was pounding so fiercely in my chest, I could feel its frantic rhythm in my temples, the blood rushing in my ears. If this is all true, every bit of it, why hasn't anyone come forward before? Why hasn't anyone reported her to the police? Why haven't these families pressed charges? It's a combination of factors: immense pride, deep embarrassment, and the unfortunate legal complexities of the situation, Rebecca explained patiently. She never technically stole anything from them. The men themselves gave her access to accounts, willingly believing they were planning their future together. The parents voluntarily sold their properties or willingly took out loans, albeit under immense pressure and emotional blackmail. And Sarah is incredibly skilled at manipulating the situation, always managing to create a narrative where she appears to be the heartbroken, wronged party when she abruptly ends the engagements. My mind flashed back to countless moments over the past 3 years. Mark's defensive reactions whenever I had expressed even mild reservations about Sarah. How he seemed to become increasingly isolated from his old longtime friends since their relationship began. How Sarah had subtly but effectively directed their social life exclusively toward her own circle of affluent friends and acquaintances. How do you know all of this information? I asked, a hint of suspicion creeping into my voice, despite the chilling ring of truth in her words. Because I unfortunately helped her once. Rebecca admitted, her tone filled with shame and regret. With Daniel, the second fiancé, I was manipulated into corroborating a false story she had created about him having an inappropriate relationship with a colleague at his office. It wasn't true at all, but I backed her up because she was incredibly convincing and managed to persuade me that he had wronged her terribly. Later, after their engagement ended, I found undeniable evidence, including shocking text messages, that revealed she had planned the entire scenario all along, including specifically targeting his mother's house for its equity. Why are you telling me this now, of all possible days? I asked, my voice rising with a mixture of fear and confusion. Why today, the day of his wedding? Because last night? Rebecca said, her voice cracking with emotion. She called me completely drunk, laughing cruelly about how she had successfully managed to drive a painful wedge between you and Mark. How she had completely convinced him that you were selfish and unsupportive of his dreams. She said, and I am quoting her exact words here, "Another sentimental old bat who will probably just die alone in a nursing home while I thoroughly enjoy her liquidated equity." The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of those words stole my breath away, leaving me momentarily speechless. I closed my eyes tightly, and suddenly, all the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Sarah's immediate and persistent focus on the value of my house, her practiced sympathy when discussing my financial situation, her subtle but effective encouragement of Mark's worst tendencies towards status seeking, and the relentless pursuit of material acquisition. I know I absolutely should have come forward with this information much sooner. Rebecca continued, her voice filled with remorse. But she has a very powerful way of making people feel incredibly afraid of her retaliation. She is notoriously vindictive and utterly ruthless when she feels crossed or threatened. After I finally confronted her about what she did to Daniel, she deliberately spread malicious rumors that ultimately led to me being fired from my job. I had to move cities and start my life over completely, somewhere else just to escape her influence. "Why are you risking calling me now, then?" I asked, still unsure of her motives. "Because I simply cannot live with myself if I allow it to happen to someone else again," Rebecca said, her voice firm, with renewed resolve. Last night's cruel phone call was my absolute breaking point. The way she spoke about you, about Mark. She hesitated for a moment. "There's more Mrs. Sullivan something about financial trouble that Mark doesn't even know about." Beatrice had gotten out of her car and was walking towards my front door. Her face etched with concern as she saw me through the window clutching the phone. I waved her inside my mind, reeling, struggling to absorb the cascade of shocking information. "What financial trouble are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah lost her job at her firm 3 months ago," Rebecca revealed. "She's been pretending to go to work every day, keeping up the charade. But she was actually fired for falsifying client billings and engaging in fraudulent practices. She is now deeply in debt, credit cards, a severe shopping addiction, and significant gambling losses. She desperately needs Mark's income and other sources of cash flow, like the equity from your house. Selling your home would conveniently solve a lot of her immediate financial problems." The doorbell rang, and Beatrice, using the spare key I kept hidden, let herself in. She found me standing in the entryway, pale-faced and trembling, the phone still clutched tightly in my white-knuckled hand. "Ellie, what on earth is wrong?" she whispered, taking in my shocked and distraught expression. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you still there?" Rebecca asked through the phone line, her voice laced with urgency. "Yes," I managed to respond, my voice shaking slightly. Do do you have any actual proof of any of this? Mark won't believe me without concrete evidence. He is very much in love with her, completely infatuated. Even as I spoke the words, a cold doubt crept into my mind. Was what Mark felt truly love? Or had he too been expertly manipulated into believing a false version of it? I have overwhelming proof. Rebecca confirmed, her voice confident now. I have screenshots of text conversations between Sarah and me, copies of the wedding contracts from her previous engagements, photographs of the properties her other fiancé's parents were forced to sell, and most importantly, a recording of Sarah's call from last night. She paused, her voice grim. I started secretly recording our conversations after what happened with Daniel purely for my own protection. I glanced quickly at the clock on the wall. 9:45 a.m. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 11 a.m., less than an hour and a half left. Can you possibly send all of this information to me immediately? I asked urgently. By email. It's already done, Rebecca replied. I anticipated you would need it quickly. I sent everything, the documents, the screenshots, the audio file, to the email address listed for you in the alumni directory from your nursing school. I sincerely hope it's still current. I quickly confirmed the email address, then asked the question that had been weighing heaviest on my heart, a knot of pain in my chest. Why target Mark? Why my son, specifically? Rebecca's sigh carried the weight of years of accumulated regret and understanding. Sarah meticulously researches potential marks, she explained. She looks for men who are professionally successful like Mark, but not independently wealthy. Men who are genuinely close to their parents, especially if those parents own property free and clear, with no mortgage. Men who might be a bit insecure socially, perhaps overly eager to impress, and I am truly sorry to have to say this, Mrs. Sullivan. Men who might be somewhat estranged or distant from one of their parents, as this creates a specific vulnerability that she can skillfully exploit. The description fit Mark with painful, heartbreaking accuracy. After his father died, Mark had poured himself completely into his work, using professional success and ambition as a way to process his grief and perhaps fill the void left by Bob. His social circle had naturally narrowed as he focused intensely on building his career. And while we had remained close, there had always been a subtle distance between us. Perhaps his lingering guilt over being somewhat absent during much of his father's final illness, his growing discomfort with my simpler, more modest lifestyle, as his own tastes and expenditures grew increasingly expensive and luxurious. Mark lost his father 12 years ago, I said softly, stating the simple, devastating truth. It was incredibly difficult for him, a loss that deeply affected him. I am truly, profoundly sorry, Mrs. Sullivan, for everything you and Mark have been through, Rebecca said, her voice sounding genuinely remorseful. I should have spoken up much sooner, years ago. You are speaking up now, I replied, surprised by the unexpected steadiness and strength in my own voice. That is what truly matters in this moment. After quickly arranging to stay in contact, I hung up the phone and turned to face a bewildered-looking Beatrice. In quick, concise sentences, I explained everything I had just learned, the shocking truth about Sarah Bradford. My God, Lily! Beatrice breathed, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief when I finished recounting the story. What on earth are you going to do now? I glanced at the clock again. It was nearly 10:00 a.m. Time was running out rapidly. Check my email first, I said, my mind racing. Then I will decide what needs to be done. My ancient desktop computer seemed to take an eternity to boot up the minutes, stretching into what felt like hours in my heightened state of anxiety. When I finally managed to access my email, Rebecca's urgent message was there waiting with multiple attached files. Beatrice and I huddled together in front of the screen, our heads close, scanning through the damning text messages, financial documents, and shocking photographs of properties that had indeed been sold, just as Rebecca had described, to finance elaborate weddings that ultimately never took place. The most disturbing piece of evidence was the audio file Sarah's voice, slightly slurred from alcohol, but unmistakable, laughing cruelly about her successful manipulation of Mark and her cold-hearted plans for the proceeds from the sale of my house. The casual, almost gleeful cruelty with which she discussed my son, referring to him dismissively as easily managed and conveniently estranged from Mommy, made my stomach turn with nausea and pure disgust. "We absolutely have to get this information to Mark immediately," Beatrice said urgently, her voice filled with conviction. "Right now, before he walks down that aisle and makes the biggest, most devastating mistake of his life." I nodded in agreement, my hands trembling slightly as I gathered the pages I had hastily printed, the paper rustling softly. "But he won't take my calls," I said, stating the frustrating truth. "He blocked my number weeks ago." Beatrice considered this logistical challenge for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "What about his best man?" she suggested. "Andy, isn't it the one who went to college with him, his longtime friend? Andy?" I corrected, a small flicker of hope igniting within me. "Yes, Andrew. They've been friends since their freshman year in university. Mark hasn't spoken much about him lately, but Sarah wouldn't have been able to completely isolate Mark from his oldest, most trusted friend." Beatrice finished understanding my thought process, especially not someone who is standing up as his best man in the wedding party. "Do you happen to have Andy's phone number?" I did, thankfully, somewhere buried deep within the pages of my old physical address book. After a frantic, hurried search, I finally located it and dialed the number with trembling fingers, silently praying that he hadn't changed his number in the years since I'd last contacted him. The call went directly to voicemail. I left a brief, urgent message stating my name and asking him to please call me back, immediately emphasizing that it was incredibly important and concerned Mark. Then, running out of options and time, I made a final desperate decision. "We are going to the wedding," I said firmly, gathering the printed evidence into a thin folder, my resolve hardening. "Not as invited guests, but with the sole purpose of stopping it from happening." Beatrice looked skeptical for a moment, her expression doubtful. "Ellie, they will never let you anywhere near him. You said the venue has hired security for the event. Then we will simply find another way to get to him." I insisted, a mother's fierce determination, overriding all other practical considerations or fears. "I will not, under any circumstances, allow that woman to destroy my son's life." As we hurried out the door and towards Beatrice's car, the full gravity and potential consequences of what we were attempting hit me squarely. I was about to possibly humiliate my only son, publicly expose his fiancée on what was supposed to be the happiest, most important day of his life. Even armed with irrefutable evidence, there was a devastating possibility that he might not believe me, might dismiss it as the actions of a bitter, jealous mother. He might even hate me forever for interfering, for taking this drastic action. But the alternative, standing idly by while he married a woman who saw him as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited, a stepping stone to her own gain, was utterly unthinkable, a future I could not allow to happen. Bob always said I was far too protective of Mark. I murmured as Beatrice expertly navigated the morning traffic, at speeds that were decidedly above the legal limit, her focus fixed on getting us there as quickly as possible. That I needed to step back and allow Mark to make his own mistakes in life. There are common mistakes, Ellie, and then there are absolute catastrophes, Beatrice replied grimly, her eyes on the road ahead. This situation falls firmly into the latter category, a potential disaster. Oak Ridge Estate appeared ahead in the distance, its sprawling, meticulously manicured grounds and elegant, imposing facade presenting a stark contrast to the intense emotional turmoil we carried with us inside the car. Luxury cars filled the expansive parking area, and guests dressed in formal wedding attire were already making their way, leisurely, toward the picturesque garden area where the ceremony was scheduled to take place. My heart sank as I spotted a uniformed security guard standing near the entrance to the garden checking invitations. Beatrice wisely parked at the far end of the parking lot a good distance away, and we sat for a moment in the car, quickly formulating a desperate plan. The service entrance. I finally suggested, remembering details from my many years as a nurse and navigating the back hallways of hospitals and other large institutions. From my nursing days, I know there's always a back way in for deliveries, catering staff, and maintenance personnel. Beatrice nodded approvingly, a spark of her old emergency room efficiency in her eyes. Now you are thinking like the Ellie I trained alongside, in the ER, quick and resourceful. Let's go. We made our way carefully around the perimeter of the vast property, trying our best to look purposeful and as if we belonged, rather than like two suspicious women in formal dresses sneaking around the back of a wedding venue. Behind the main building, concealed from the front entrance, we found what we were looking for. A utilitarian entrance where catering staff bustled in and out, carrying trays loaded with food and equipment, clearly in the final stages of preparation. "Follow my lead closely," Beatrice whispered, smoothing down her dress and adopting the imperious, no-nonsense expression she had perfected over decades of managing busy hospital departments and demanding doctors. She approached a young man in catering attire who looked particularly harried and overwhelmed. "Excuse me," she said crisply, cutting through his focus. "We are urgently looking for the groom's suite. Immediately. Miss Bradford sent us with an extremely urgent message for Mr. Sullivan." The young man barely glanced at us, too preoccupied with balancing a tray, overflowing with champagne flutes. "Second floor, East Wing," he mumbled quickly. "But they are moving out to the ceremony site in like 5 minutes, so you need to hurry." We slipped inside the building unnoticed, navigating the controlled chaos and frantic activity of a high-end wedding in its final stages of preparation. Following small signs posted on the walls, we located the stairs and ascended quickly, the thin folder containing the printed evidence clutched tightly in my hands. The hallway on the second floor was remarkably quiet compared to the bustling activity downstairs, the thick carpet muffling our footsteps as we searched for the area designated as the East Wing. A burst of male laughter echoing from down the hall guided us to a door clearly marked Groom's Suite. I hesitated for a moment, my courage faltering, suddenly paralyzed by a wave of doubt. What if he doesn't believe me? Bear? I whispered to Beatrice, my voice trembling. What if this only pushes him further away from me forever? Beatrice squeezed my hand reassuringly, her grip firm and comforting. That is a painful risk we absolutely have to take, Ellie. The truth is still the truth even, and perhaps especially when it is incredibly painful to hear or accept. I took a deep, fortifying breath, trying to steady myself, and knocked firmly on the door. The door swung open almost immediately to reveal Andy Mark's best man. He looked handsome and uncomfortable in his formal tuxedo, but somehow smaller, less vibrant, than the exuberant young man who used to spend holidays at our dinner table sharing stories and laughter. His eyes widened in sheer shock and disbelief at the sight of me standing there. "Mrs. Sullivan," he gasped, stepping quickly into the hallway and pulling the door nearly closed behind him, clearly trying to shield the view from inside the suite. What are you doing here? Mark said you weren't." "Andy, please listen to me." I interrupted, desperation making my voice quiver with urgency. "I absolutely need to speak with my son immediately. It's incredibly urgent, a matter of extreme importance." He glanced nervously over his shoulder, clearly conflicted and uncomfortable. "This is really not a good time, Mrs. Sullivan. We are literally heading downstairs to the ceremony in just a few minutes, and Mark is already incredibly stressed about... It's about Sarah," I said bluntly, cutting to the chase, knowing I had limited time to get through to him. "She is not who he thinks she is, Andy. I have concrete evidence that he needs to see now, before he makes a terrible, irreversible mistake." Something subtle flickered across Andy's face, a fleeting shadow of doubt or recognition that told me perhaps he wasn't entirely surprised by my words, that he might have had his own reservations or suspicions. "Andy!" Mark's voice called out from within the suite, sounding slightly impatient. "Who is at the door? Is everything all right?" Before Andy could formulate a response or close the door completely, it was pulled fully open, and my son stood directly before me. The sight of him looking so handsome and mature in his tuxedo, so incredibly like his father, nearly took my breath away. For a moment, he simply stared at me, disbelief etched deeply across his features, his eyes wide with shock. "Mom." The word emerged as a barely audible half-whisper, as if he were hallucinating or seeing a ghost. Then his expression instantly hardened his face, closing off emotionally. "What are you doing here? I made it explicitly clear that you were not welcome to attend." The coldness and complete lack of warmth in his voice cut deep a painful wound, but Rebecca's shocking revelations and Bob's words from the journal gave me the necessary courage and strength to stand my ground. "Mark, please, I am only asking for 5 minutes of your time. There is something critically important. You absolutely need to know something. You must see before the ceremony begins." "I don't need to know anything right now." He snapped back, his voice sharp with anger and resentment. "Except that you have clearly chosen your house a building over my future happiness. I honestly cannot believe that you would show up here uninvited on my wedding day, with the sole intention of causing a scene and embarrassing me." "I am not here to cause a scene, Mark," I said, struggling desperately to keep my voice steady and calm, refusing to match his anger. "I am here defying your wishes because I love you too much deeply and unconditionally to stay silent and let this happen." Beatrice, sensing the escalating tension, stepped forward to support me. "Mark, your mother received some very disturbing and compelling information this morning. Information specifically about Sarah that you absolutely need to hear and see before you make this commitment." Mark's face flushed bright red with a surge of renewed anger. "So you brought reinforcements with you to ambush me. This is exactly precisely why I did not want you here today. You have never once given Sarah a fair chance. You have been completely against her from the very beginning, haven't you? Simply because she sees right through your manipulative..." "Mark Bob Sullivan." I interrupted him sharply, using my strongest, most authoritative mother's tone, a tone that rarely failed to cut through his tirade. "I have never in my life lied to you, not once, and I am not starting now on this day. Please, I beg you, just 5 minutes is all I ask. If after you have seen and heard what I have, you still genuinely want to go through with this wedding, I will leave quietly, immediately. You will never have to see me again if that is truly what you wish." Something in my words, perhaps the raw, painful sincerity of that final drastic promise, caused him to pause, to hesitate. He glanced quickly at his watch, then looked at Andy, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of agreement, signaling that it might be wise to listen. "Fine," Mark conceded icily, his anger still simmering just beneath the surface. 5 minutes. In here." He gestured toward a small adjoining sitting room across the hall, a private space separate from where the other groomsmen were gathered in the main suite. Once inside the sitting room with the door closed firmly behind us, I wasted absolutely no time. "Sarah has been previously engaged 3 separate times before you." I began, my voice steady now, opening the folder containing the printed evidence. "Each and every time she specifically targeted men whose parents possessed significant financial assets but limited readily available cash flow. Each time she skillfully manipulated the situation to pressure the parents into liquidating their property or taking out substantial loans specifically to finance lavish, over-the-top weddings. And each time she abruptly broke off the engagement just moments before the ceremony was scheduled to take place, but not before securing access to joint bank accounts and other financial assets." Mark stared at me, his expression one of utter disbelief, as if I had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language he didn't understand. "That's completely ridiculous, Mom. That's utterly insane." "I genuinely wish it were, sweetheart," I said softly, my heart aching for the pain he was about to experience. I handed him the printouts Rebecca had sent. "These are actual text messages exchanged between Sarah and her former roommate Rebecca. This particular one," I pointed to a specific message, "specifically mentions targeting your mother's cute little house, as far back as your 3rd date together." His hands began to shake slightly as he scanned the messages, disbelief warring fiercely with the undeniable evidence laid out before him on the page. These could easily be faked. Anyone could create phony screenshots like these," he stammered, clutching the papers tightly. "Listen to this, then," Beatrice said, calmly taking my phone and pressing play on the audio recording of Sarah's drunken call from the previous night. Sarah's distinctive voice, slurred but instantly recognizable, filled the small, quiet room. "Just another sentimental old bat who'll probably just die alone in a nursing home while I thoroughly enjoy her liquidated equity. Mark is even easier to manage than Daniel was. So pathetically desperate for approval, so conveniently estranged from Mommy." The color completely drained from Mark's face as the recording continued. Sarah laughingly describing how she planned to access his accounts immediately after the wedding, how she urgently needed the money from the sale of my house to cover a few minor financial hiccups that her unsuspecting fiancé knew absolutely nothing about. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the room was absolute and deafening. Mark sank heavily onto a small settee nearby, the papers trembling uncontrollably in his hands, his eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. "There is more evidence, Mark," I said gently, my voice quiet. "Financial records showing she was fired from her prestigious firm 3 months ago for falsifying client billings and engaging in financial fraud credit card statements, detailing over $200,000 in accumulated debt documentation of the previous weddings that never happened, and photographic evidence of the properties her former fiancé's parents were forced to sell to finance those elaborate events." Mark stared down at the physical evidence, his expression shifting rapidly from disbelief to utter confusion, then to a dawning, heartbreaking horror that tore at my own heart to witness. She told me she was promoted. He murmured almost to himself, his voice barely audible. She's been going to work every single day. She shows me emails from her clients, from her colleagues. His voice trailed off completely as his eyes fell upon the falsified employment records. She has been lying to you, sweetheart, I said softly, using the endearment I hadn't dared to speak in months, the familiar word feeling both tender and painful on my tongue. About her job, about her entire past, and most importantly, about her true intentions for you. Mark finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw, vulnerable pain, and in that moment I saw my little boy again, hurt, confused, needing his mother's comfort and protection. "Why, Mom?" he asked simply, his voice small and broken. "Why me? Why would she do this to me?" I sat down gently beside him on the settee, careful not to touch him, yet sensing he was too fragile, too emotionally raw for physical comfort in that moment. "Rebecca explained it," Beatrice added gently, understanding Mark's need for a rational explanation amidst the emotional chaos. "Sarah meticulously researches potential targets men who are professionally successful, but not independently wealthy. Men who are genuinely close to their parents, especially if those parents own property outright. Men who might be socially insecure, in some way perhaps overly eager to please and impress, and men with some degree of estrangement from a parent." She repeated the painful truth, creating a potential vulnerability she could skillfully exploit. Mark flinched visibly at that last part, his gaze dropping immediately to his hands, which were still clutching the damning papers. "After Dad died," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, I threw myself completely into my work, into building something successful that I thought would make him proud, make you proud." "Oh, Mark." I breathed, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces, reaching out finally to gently take his hand in mine. "Your father was already incredibly proud of you, sweetheart, and so am I. Not simply for what you've achieved professionally, but for the kind of person you are deep down." "Who am I, Mom?" he asked bitterly, gesturing vaguely to his tuxedo, to the opulent surroundings of the estate, the symbol of the life he had been chasing. Someone who was ready to cold-heartedly cut his own mother out of his life, a mother who sacrificed everything for him, for a woman who saw him as nothing but a meal ticket, someone so pathetically desperate for status and acceptance in a world that isn't mine, that he couldn't even see what was right in front of him. "You are human, Mark," I said firmly, looking him directly in the eyes. "We all make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. We all have needs. We all want to be loved, to belong, to be accepted. Sarah exploited that very human need, that vulnerability within you." A sharp, insistent knock at the door interrupted our painful, intimate conversation. Andy poked his head into the room, his expression tense and worried. "Mark," he said urgently, "everyone is waiting for you. The officiant just said we need to start the ceremony in 5 minutes exactly, or we'll completely lose our allocated time slot for the garden ceremony." Mark stared at the documentation in his lap, his eyes moving between the papers and my face, indecision and anguish clearly written across his features. "What? What do I do now, Mom?" he asked, his voice sounding younger, more vulnerable than I had heard it in years. "There are 200 people out there waiting. Sarah's entire family, all my colleagues, everyone we know. You have several options, Mark," Beatrice said, practically stepping forward. "You can postpone the wedding, feigning some kind of emergency. You could potentially go through with the ceremony, knowing what you know now, and attempt to deal with the devastating aftermath later. Or Mark, you can end it here and now." Mark ran a trembling hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting it in a gesture that reminded me so powerfully of his father. "If I postpone or try to go through with it," he said quietly, his gaze distant, "I'm just prolonging the inevitable, aren't I? Once I know this truth, this betrayal, I can never ever unknow it." "No, sweetheart," I agreed softly, tears welling in my eyes again. "You can't." Another knock, louder and more insistent this time. Mark. It was Sarah's father, his authoritative booming voice, unmistakable even through the thick wooden door. What on earth is the holdup Sarah is completely ready to process in? Mark took a deep, steadying breath, squaring his shoulders in a gesture so incredibly like Bob that fresh tears pricked my eyes. "I need to see her," he said, standing up slowly. "I need to look her directly in the eyes when I ask her about all of this." "Is that genuinely wise, Mark?" Beatrice asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "She is a master manipulator. She might try to talk her way out of it, twist the situation, make it seem like this is all your fault, or your mother's fault." Mark gathered the evidence, folding the printouts carefully and tucking the folder securely into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket. "Maybe she will," he conceded. "But I need to do this my way, face to face." He turned to me, his expression a complex mixture of pain, gratitude, and burgeoning resolve. "Thank you for coming today, Mom," he said, his voice rough with emotion. For not giving up on me even when I had completely given up on you." Before I could formulate a response, he opened the door and strode purposefully into the hallway, brushing past Sarah's startled-looking father without a word of explanation. Andy gave me a quick, encouraging nod before following Mark, leaving Beatrice and me standing alone in the small sitting room. "Well," Beatrice said after a moment of stunned silence breaking the tension, "that certainly did not go quite how I expected it would." "No," I agreed, my heart racing in my chest. "But he heard us be. He believed us. That is more than I honestly dared to hope for." "What do we do now?" Beatrice asked, looking around the quiet room, unsure of our next steps. I glanced at my watch. 10:58 a.m. The ceremony was moments away from starting. "Now," I said, my voice firm, "we wait, and we pray that he finds the inner strength to do what needs to be done to face the truth he has uncovered." We made our way slowly and discreetly downstairs, carefully avoiding the main reception areas where guests were already milling about. Through a large window, I could see the garden ceremony site laid out before us, neat rows of white chairs adorned with lavish floral arrangements, a beautiful flower-covered archway where vows would be exchanged, musicians poised with their instruments, ready to play the bridal march. So much expense, so much meticulously planned spectacle, all I now knew, built on a foundation of elaborate lies and cold calculation. The sound of raised voices drew our attention to a side corridor near the main hall. Mark and Sarah were standing facing each other in what appeared to be a small antechamber or staging area, its door slightly ajar. She was absolutely resplendent, breathtakingly beautiful, in a designer gown that must have cost more than my annual pension. Her expression was a mixture of initial confusion and rapidly increasing alarm as Mark spoke. His back was turned towards us so we couldn't see his face or hear his words. Beatrice and I couldn't make out what he was saying, but we could clearly see Sarah's face transform, first disbelief, then defensive anger flashing in her eyes, then a cold, calculating calm that sent a shiver down my spine, even from our distance. She reached out for Mark, placing a hand on his arm, her expression softening into something that feigned genuine distress and hurt. I could see her mouth forming words that clearly looked like denials, frantic explanations, perhaps even wild accusations against me. Mark shook his head, his posture rigid, and gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the papers, the folder of evidence. Sarah's carefully constructed composure faltered visibly as he handed them to her one sheet at a time. Even from our vantage point, I could see the exact moment when understanding and then fury dawned on her face. The devastating realization that her elaborate scheme had been exposed, that this particular target would not be as easily manipulated or discarded as the others. Her transformation was startling and complete. The beautiful, controlled woman who had looked down her nose at my modest home and simple life vanished, replaced by someone whose face contorted with raw, venomous fury. She snatched violently at the papers still in Mark's hands, ripping several before he could step back out of her reach. Her voice rose sharply now, clearly audible, even to us in the corridor. "You ungrateful, pathetic little man," she shrieked, her voice filled with contempt. "Do you have any idea, any conception of what you are throwing away right now? Who do you think would ever want you genuinely want you without me by your side? You are nothing, Mark. Nothing but a small-time architect from nowhere with your shabby little firm and your sad little dreams." Mark stood perfectly still, absorbing the torrent of verbal abuse and cruel words with a remarkable calmness that spoke volumes about his newfound clarity and inner strength. When she finally paused for breath, his response was too quiet for us to hear the specific words, but its effect on Sarah was immediate and electric. Whatever he said made her recoil physically, as if he had just slapped her across the face. For a moment they stood frozen in a dramatic tableau. Mark straight-backed and resolute, his face pale but determined, Sarah trembling with thwarted rage and humiliation. Then she did something I honestly never would have expected from the polished, controlled woman I thought I knew. She picked up a heavy crystal vase from a nearby table and hurled it with full force at the wall right beside Mark's head. The loud crash of shattering glass brought several startled wedding staff running to the scene. Sarah stormed past them, roughly shoving aside a concerned-looking woman wearing a coordinator's headset. She disappeared down the corridor, the long train of her expensive designer gown sweeping behind her like a vengeful storm cloud. Mark remained standing in the small antechamber, his back still to us, his shoulders slightly slumped as if a great heavy weight had been lifted from him, but had left painful bruises in its wake. After a moment, Andy appeared quickly at his side, saying something reassuring that made Mark nod slowly in agreement. "Should we go to him now, Ellie?" Beatrice whispered, watching the dramatic scene unfold with wide, concerned eyes. I shook my head gently. "Not yet, Bea. He needs a minute, needs some space to process what just happened." Andy gently guided Mark toward another door, presumably leading to a more private space, to give him some reprieve from the growing number of staff and curious guests, drawn by the commotion and the sound of shattering glass. I caught a glimpse of my son's profile as he turned. His face was ashen, but composed, his jaw set in the same determined expression I had seen on Bob's face when he was facing difficult truth or challenges. "What happens now?" Beatrice asked as we watched them disappear from view. "I honestly don't know, Bea." I admitted feeling a mixture of relief and profound uncertainty. "But whatever the future holds, I will be here for him, standing by his side, if he wants me to be." Before Beatrice could respond, Sarah's father appeared at the end of the corridor, his face thunderous and red with rage, as he surveyed the broken glass scattered on the floor and the confused-looking staff. His eyes immediately landed on me, narrowing in recognition and instant hostility. "You," he said, advancing rapidly towards us with barely contained fury in his voice. "This is all you're doing, isn't it? You couldn't bear to see your son genuinely happy, could you? You just had to poison him against Sarah because you are clearly jealous of her youth, her incredible success, her rightful place in his life." I straightened my spine, refusing to be intimidated by his bluster-meeting, his furious gaze steadily. "Mr. Bradford," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I completely understand that you are upset right now, but perhaps it would be wise for you to speak with your daughter and hear her explanation before making such baseless accusations. My daughter is in tears." He shouted, his face reddening dangerously with anger. "She is utterly devastated because your son just unilaterally called off the entire wedding minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Do you have any idea, any remote concept of the sheer humiliation, the immense expense involved? We have 200 important guests waiting out there. I am sincerely sorry for any inconvenience this has caused," I replied, keeping my voice deliberately calm and even refusing to be drawn into his emotional outburst. "However, Mr. Bradford, I am far more concerned about the fact that your daughter has a clear and documented pattern of targeting men specifically for financial gain, callously breaking off engagements only after their families have been pressured into liquidating significant assets and then walking away from the situation with substantial sums of money that were never returned." My direct factual statement stopped him cold in his tracks. His angry expression shifted subtly, a fleeting flicker of something. Was it knowledge concern? Crossing his features for just a moment before hardening again into righteous indignation. "That's preposterous. That's blatant defamation I could sue you for." "You certainly could, Mr. Bradford," Beatrice interjected smoothly, stepping slightly forward, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. "But if you were to pursue legal action, then all the evidence we possess would become part of the public record, the audio recordings, the text messages, the extensive documentation of previous engagements and financial transactions. Is that truly a risk you are willing to take, sir?" The undeniable implication hung heavy in the air between us. After a long, tense moment of silence, he visibly stepped back, straightening his tie, in a gesture that seemed designed to buy him time to think, rather than actually adjust his appearance. "I don't know what kind of twisted game you're playing here," he said, his voice now controlled, almost unnervingly diplomatic. "But let me assure you this is most certainly not over. Sarah and Mark have simply had a misunderstanding, nothing more. Every couple experiences arguments and jitters before the wedding. It's perfectly normal pre-ceremony stress." His attempt to minimize the devastating scene that had just occurred would have been almost comical if it weren't so desperately sad and revealing. I couldn't help but wonder how many times he had made similar excuses and justifications for his daughter's behavior in the past. How many clear warning signs he had deliberately ignored or rationalized away. "Mr. Bradford," I said gently, my voice filled with quiet conviction. "I think deep down we both know this is far more than just jitters or a simple misunderstanding. Your daughter needs serious help, professional intervention, not continued enablement and cover-ups. And my son, Mark, deserves the fundamental truth." Before he could formulate a response, Andy reappeared at the end of the corridor, scanning the area until he spotted me. He hurried over quickly, pointedly ignoring Mr. Bradford's presence. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, slightly out of breath, his voice conveying urgency. "Mark is asking for you. He's in the library on the east side of the building." He glanced briefly at the shattered glass on the floor, the hovering staff, and Mr. Bradford's thunderous expression. It's been quite a morning for everyone." "Thank you, Andy," I said, reaching out to gently squeeze his arm, my gratitude immense. "Thank you for everything you've done today." As Beatrice and I followed Andy toward the library, leaving Mr. Bradford standing alone amidst the wreckage of his daughter's latest scheme, I felt a curious, complex mixture of deep sorrow and profound relief. The wedding that had consumed my thoughts and energy for months, the event that had driven a painful wedge between me and my son, was now definitively cancelled. But at what ultimate cost to my son's heart, his pride and his public reputation, Mark had narrowly escaped a disastrous marriage, but he now faced the immense humiliation of explaining to 200 guests why there would be no ceremony. Yet beneath these immediate concerns ran a powerful current of cautious hope. Mark had asked for me, specifically asked for his mother. After months of hurtful silence and crushing rejection, my son wanted, perhaps even needed, his mother by his side as he navigated the devastating aftermath of betrayal and public embarrassment. It was a beginning, tenuous, fragile, and uncertain, but undeniably real and significant. Outside the library door, I paused for a moment, gathering my courage, preparing myself for whatever lay ahead, whatever the immediate future held. Uncomfortable explanations to disappointed guests, potential legal confrontations with Sarah's family, the long and arduous process of Mark rebuilding his shattered trust in others, and perhaps more importantly, in himself. I knew with absolute certainty that we would face it together side by side. "Ready, Ellie?" Beatrice asked softly, standing patiently beside me. I nodded, straightening the elegant pearl necklace she had loaned me just a few hours earlier, in what now felt like an entirely different lifetime, a time when I had planned only to witness my son's wedding from a lonely distance. "Ready, B!" I confirmed, and with that, I opened the door, stepping forward into whatever came next, ready to face it with my son. The library at Oak Ridge Estate was a true sanctuary of quiet elegance, a stark contrast to the chaos we had just left. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. The air was filled with the faint, pleasant scent of old paper and polished wood. Deep, comfortable leather chairs were arranged invitingly, and tall arched windows bathed the room in soft natural light, illuminating the scene. Mark stood with his back to one of these large windows, his silhouette framed against the bright spring day outside. He had removed his bow tie and jacket, and somehow this small act of dishevelment, of letting down his guard, even slightly made him look more like the son I knew, more like himself than he had in months. When he turned at the sound of the door opening, I saw the undeniable evidence of tears on his face, streaks running through the residual makeup applied for the wedding photos. Without a moment's hesitation, I opened my arms wide, and he crossed the room in 3 long, purposeful strides to embrace me. For a precious moment, we simply held each other tightly locked in a long overdue embrace, the first genuine physical contact we had shared since the painful argument that had so severely severed our relationship 6 months ago. "I am so incredibly sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice rough and thick with raw emotion, his face buried against my shoulder. "I said terrible things to you, unforgivable things, things I regret more than you can ever know. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, my son could ever do or say that I wouldn't forgive." I replied, my own voice thick with emotion, gently stroking his hair as I had done when he was a little boy, frightened by thunderstorms outside his bedroom window. "Nothing you could do that could ever make me stop loving you unconditionally. Nothing." He pulled back slightly, wiping his eyes roughly with the heel of his hand, in a gesture so heartbreakingly reminiscent of his childhood that my heart constricted painfully in my chest. How did you know about Sarah? About all of it? He asked, his eyes searching mine, filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. I explained everything, recounting the unexpected phone call from Rebecca, watching Mark's expression shift rapidly between disbelief, anger, and then a painful dawning acceptance as I painstakingly relayed the details of Sarah's calculated pattern of deception and exploitation, her history with Michael and Daniel. 200 people, he said, finally shaking his head slowly, in dismay, his voice filled with a profound sense of shame and embarrassment. There are 200 people out there all dressed up, waiting for a wedding that is simply not going to happen now. Colleagues, clients, friends. How can I possibly face them? They will understand Mark. Beatrice offered gently from where she had quietly settled into one of the comfortable leather chairs, giving us space, but remaining present. Better to face an hour of uncomfortable explanations and questioning than a lifetime in a disastrous, fraudulent marriage. Mark managed a weak, shaky smile, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Voice of reason as always, Bea. Someone has to be, she replied affectionately, a small knowing smile on her face. With you Sullivans, and your dramatic tendencies for getting into complicated situations. Andy knocked discreetly and entered the room carrying a silver tray, bearing a beautiful coffee service, complete with porcelain cups and saucers. Thought we could all use this, he said, setting the tray down on a mahogany side table. Figured it would be a bit better than the champagne they keep trying to bring in everywhere. As he began to pour the coffee, a sudden flurry of activity in the corridor outside caught our attention. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the crackle and squawk of walkie-talkies. The wedding coordinator, a young woman who had seemed so composed and in control earlier, appeared at the library door, her professional composure noticeably strained and flustered. Mr. Sullivan, she began hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I genuinely don't mean to intrude at such a difficult moment, but the situation outside is becoming somewhat difficult to manage. Miss Bradford has, she has rather dramatically departed the premises rather abruptly in the bridal car. She paused delicately, choosing her words carefully. Her parents are currently speaking with guests, suggesting there has been an unexpected postponement of the ceremony due to a medical emergency concerning you. She paused again, her expression questioning. Is that the narrative you would prefer us to support and communicate? Mark stared at her blankly for a moment, completely taken aback. A medical emergency concerning me. Mr. Bradford is apparently telling everyone that you suffered a severe panic attack just before the ceremony. Andy explained, his expression a complex mixture of concern and reluctant amusement at the absurdity of the lie. Apparently, you are now heavily sedated and resting, and the wedding will simply be rescheduled for a later date. That's completely absurd, Mark said indignantly, straightening his shoulders, refusing to accept the lie. I am clearly not sedated, and I am not having a medical crisis. It's likely a face-saving fiction. I suggested gently understanding the Bradfords' motivation. For them as much as it might potentially be for you to avoid public embarrassment. He considered this for a moment, then shook his head decisively, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. No, absolutely not. I will not start the next chapter of my life, whatever that may be, with a blatant lie, no matter how convenient it might seem right now. He turned back to the wedding coordinator, his voice clear and firm. Please inform the guests on my behalf that I deeply apologize for the inconvenience and disappointment this has caused. But the wedding has been canceled, not postponed, permanently canceled. They are, however, absolutely welcome to stay for the reception meal if they wish. It has already been paid for regardless. I will make a brief statement in..." He glanced at his watch, assessing the time. 15 minutes from now in the main hall, to address everyone personally. The coordinator nodded, clearly relieved to have received clear, decisive instructions. "Very good, sir. I will arrange for the announcement and preparations immediately." With a slight bow, she withdrew from the room. After she had left, Mark sank into one of the comfortable leather chairs, cradling his coffee cup between his hands, as if it might somehow anchor him amidst the swirling chaos. "I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice filled with apprehension. "What do I possibly say to all those people?" "The truth, Mark," I said, simply walking over to stand beside him. "Not all the painful, intricate details of Sarah's deception and history, but the essential truth that you have learned things about your relationship that make a marriage between you fundamentally impossible." He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. "And afterward? What happens then? I can't go back to my apartment right away. Sarah has a key, and half of her belongings are still there. You will come home with me, sweetheart," I said without a moment's hesitation, stating the obvious, undeniable truth. "For as long as you need to, for as long as you want to." Home. He repeated the single word, a world of meaning, of loss, and hope contained within it. I wasn't even sure I still had one after everything I said to you, after how terribly I behaved. "You will always, always have a home with me, Mark," I said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Always. This house, this is your home too." The next 15 minutes passed relatively quickly in quiet, necessary preparation. Mark, with Andy's help and guidance, drafted brief, dignified remarks on the elegant library stationery. While he wrote, I helped him restore some semblance of order to his appearance, straightening his collar, smoothing his disheveled hair. Small, familiar gestures I had performed countless times before school pictures job interviews and important events throughout his life. Andy left the room to find the rest of the groomsmen and discreetly explain the situation to them, preparing them for Mark's announcement. Beatrice stepped out briefly to make a phone call to a locksmith friend who agreed to meet us at Mark's apartment later that day to change the locks, a practical and necessary precaution given Sarah's volatile reaction. When it was time, Mark squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and led us from the quiet sanctuary of the library to the main hall where the reception would have been held. The vast space was filled with hundreds of confused and murmuring guests in their formal attire, their hushed conversations creating a nervous hum that fell abruptly silent as Mark appeared, walking with a determined stride towards the center of the room. He stood tall, his posture straight and dignified, despite the obvious strain and emotional toll evident on his face. I remained at the back of the hall with Beatrice, my heart swelling with a profound sense of pride in my son's courage and composure in the face of such public humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues," Mark began, his voice, the clear, resonant voice of an architect used to presenting to clients, carrying clearly through the hushed space. "I want to first express my deepest gratitude to you all for coming today, and then offer my most sincere apologies for the unprecedented and difficult situation you find yourselves in. There will be no wedding ceremony today." A ripple of surprised murmurs swept through the assembled crowd. Mark raised a hand gently to quiet them, allowing him to continue. "After receiving important and sensitive information this morning, I have made the difficult but necessary decision to end my relationship with Sarah." The murmurs intensified, some guests gasping softly. Mark continued, maintaining his composure. I will not be sharing the specific details publicly out of respect for privacy, both mine and Sarah's. What I will say is that I discovered fundamental incompatibilities and significant breaches of trust that make a marriage between us impossible. He paused, drawing a deep, steadying breath, gathering his strength. The staff here at Oak Ridge Estate will still be serving the planned reception meal for anyone who wishes to stay. Please consider it my way of expressing my appreciation for your understanding and patience during this incredibly awkward and unexpected situation. For those who prefer to leave now, I completely understand and apologize again for the inconvenience and wasted time. He finished his brief statement with remarkable composure, though I could see the immense emotional cost in the tightness around his eyes, the paleness of his face. As he stepped back slightly, a ripple of hesitant, then more enthusiastic, supportive applause spread through the room. Initiated, I noticed, with a surge of gratitude by Andy and the other groomsmen who had gathered near the front. Several guests immediately approached Mark with handshakes, expressions of sympathy, and quiet words of support, while others discreetly and quickly made their exits. Sarah's parents were notably absent from the hall, having apparently departed with or shortly after their daughter. It was nearly 2 hours later when we finally left Oak Ridge Estate. Mark had insisted on personally thanking every member of the staff and every vendor who had been involved, acknowledging their professionalism and efforts in managing the chaotic and unexpected situation. He had spoken briefly and gracefully with each departing guest, accepting their well wishes with quiet dignity and enduring their inevitable curiosity with remarkable composure. By the time we reached the parking lot, physical and emotional exhaustion was clearly evident in every line of his body, every movement. He slid into the back seat of Beatrice's car, without protest, leaning his head against the window, as we finally drove away from the beautiful, expensive venue that should have been the site of his wedding day, but had instead become the stage for a painful truth. "Are you holding up all right, Mark?" I asked softly from the front passenger seat, reaching across to gently touch his hand where it rested on the armrest. He nodded without opening his eyes. "Just tired, Mom," he murmured, his voice muffled. And he hesitated, searching for the right words. Embarrassed, I guess. Ashamed. I was so completely, utterly fooled by her. Sarah is incredibly skilled and practiced at deception, sweetheart, I reminded him gently. And as Rebecca explained, she targeted you specifically, not because of your flaws, but because of qualities that are actually virtues, your generosity, your deep-seated desire to care for and provide for others, your capacity for profound love and unwavering trust. I wasn't very generous or loving to you, though, was I? He said finally, opening his eyes and looking directly at me, his gaze filled with self-recrimination. I chose her over you, my own mother, without a moment's hesitation. I threatened to cut you completely out of my life if you didn't sell your home, the home you and Dad built together, the home where I grew up. Who does that? Who behaves like that towards their mother? Someone who was being masterfully manipulated and isolated. Beatrice interjected firmly from the driver's seat, her voice steady and wise. I have seen this type of psychological manipulation before Mark countless times with my patients. Predatory people like Sarah are experts at isolating their targets from anyone who might see through their carefully constructed facade. They deliberately create false choices, us versus them scenarios, forcing their target to choose between the manipulator and their loyal loved ones. It's not your fault, Mark. You were a victim of her calculated strategy. It still feels like my fault. He said quietly, looking down at his hands again. I should have seen through it, should have questioned why she was so intensely fixated on selling your house, Mom, why it mattered so much to her. I should have noticed how she subtly but persistently undermined my relationship with you, slowly isolating me from the very beginning. Hindsight, Mark, offers a clarity that none of us possess in the moment, I said, my voice filled with compassion. What truly matters now today is moving forward from this experience, learning from it. The remainder of the drive back to Maple Street passed in a contemplative, comfortable silence. As the familiar streets of my neighborhood replaced the highway, I felt Mark relax slightly beside me. When Beatrice finally turned onto Maple Street, he sat up straighter, looking out the window at the houses, the trees, the familiar surroundings, perhaps seeing the neighborhood with new eyes, or perhaps with old ones, rediscovering the quiet beauty and comfort of the street where he had grown up. Mrs. Peterson was in her front yard watering her flower beds as Beatrice pulled into my driveway. She waved cheerfully, then did a double take at the sight of Mark emerging from the car in his wedding attire, minus his jacket and tie. "Isn't today," she began, confusion evident in her voice and expression. "A very long story for another time. Helen?" Beatrice called cheerfully, quickly providing a convenient explanation. "Mark will be staying with Lily for a while. Perhaps you could bring over some of that excellent banana bread you make tomorrow morning." Mrs. Peterson, bless her kind heart, picked up on the cue. Immediately, her confusion replaced by genuine warmth and concern. "Of course, I would be absolutely delighted to. Welcome home, Mark. We've all missed seeing you around here." Inside the house, Mark stood for a moment in the entryway, looking around slowly, as if seeing the familiar space for the very first time after a long absence. His gaze lingered on the height markings scribbled on the kitchen doorframe, the collection of family photos displayed on the wall, the slightly crooked bookshelf he and his father had built together with such pride. It's exactly the same, Mom," he murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and emotion. "After everything that's happened, after how horribly I behaved towards you, you didn't change a single thing in the house." "Why would I change it, sweetheart?" I asked, simply walking over to stand beside him. "This is our home, your father's, and mine and yours too, Mark, always. This door is always open to you." He disappeared upstairs to change out of his formal wedding clothes and take a shower, as if trying to wash away the emotional residue of the day. Beatrice helped me prepare a simple, comforting meal, a childhood favorite of Mark's chicken and dumplings, a dish he had loved since he was old enough to eat solid food. "You are a truly remarkable woman, Lily Sullivan," Beatrice said quietly as she chopped carrots at the kitchen counter, watching me roll out dough for the dumplings. "After everything he said to you, after how he treated you here, you are making his favorite childhood meal and welcoming him back into your home, back into your life, without condition or recrimination." "That's simply what mothers do, Bea," I replied, though her compliment genuinely warmed me. "Love, real love, doesn't keep score of wrongs or tally up mistakes." "Still," she insisted gently, many people would hold at least a little bit of a grudge, would demand some kind of formal apology after what happened." I shrugged, focusing on the dough. "What would be the point in that right now? He is hurting enough already, dealing with the pain of this betrayal and public humiliation. Besides, he did apologize sincerely, and I believe him. The rest, the deeper healing, will come with time and patience." Later that evening, after Beatrice had gone home and Mark and I had shared a quiet meal together at the kitchen table, we sat together on the back porch swing. The garden was peaceful and still in the twilight, the azaleas luminous, almost glowing in the fading light of the setting sun. For a long while, we simply rocked back and forth in comfortable silence, the rhythmic creaking of the swing's chains, a soothing counterpoint to the emotional chaos of the day. "I spoke to Rebecca earlier," Mark said, finally breaking the silence, his voice low. "While you were setting the table for dinner, she called to check on me to see if I was all right." "That was very thoughtful and kind of her," I replied, genuinely pleased by her concern. He nodded in agreement. "She said Sarah's done this before, this level of vicious retaliation, not just the calculated engagements and financial schemes, but the brutal character assassination afterward. Apparently, her previous fiancé were subjected to a barrage of malicious rumors about infidelity, mental instability, even fabricated stories about criminal behavior. Are you worried that she will try that same tactic with you, Mark?" I asked, a fresh wave of concern washing over me. "Let her try, Mom," he said, his voice unexpectedly laced with steel and newfound resolve. "I have the undeniable evidence Rebecca provided, plus additional documentation of her financial deceptions that I found at the apartment. And unlike her previous targets, I have absolutely no intention of slinking away into embarrassed silence while she spreads lies about me." I studied my son in the gathering darkness, noting the firm set of his jaw, the determination in his profile. Perhaps Sarah had inadvertently given him something valuable, something enduring in the process of trying to destroy him, a newfound strength, a clearer understanding of his own boundaries and worth a refusal to be intimidated or silenced. "Your father, Mark," I said softly, my voice filled with emotion, "would be incredibly proud of how you handled today, standing up in front of all those people and taking responsibility, telling the truth, when you could have easily hidden behind a convenient lie." Mark was quiet for so long, I thought he might not respond. When he finally did, his voice was thick with emotion, barely above a whisper. "I found Dad's journal in my jacket pocket when I changed out of my tuxedo. I honestly don't remember putting it there myself." I smiled gently in the darkness, a small knowing smile. "I may have perhaps slipped it in there this morning before everything happened. I thought you might need his wisdom and perspective today, whatever occurred at the wedding venue." "I did, Mom," Mark admitted, his voice raw. "I read his last entry while you were in the kitchen cooking dinner, the one where he worried about my ambition, about whether I would recognize what truly matters in life about chasing the wrong things." He reached for my hand in the darkness, his fingers finding mine. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what he meant, what you both tried so hard to teach me throughout my life." "And what is that, sweetheart?" I asked, gently squeezing his fingers in return. "That a life built solely on superficial appearances, on status and wealth, is no real life at all," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "That true wealth isn't measured in square footage of an apartment or the price of a tuxedo or glittering status symbols, but in the genuine, meaningful relationships that sustain you, that support you when everything else falls apart." He glanced around slowly at the modest garden, the small porch, the humble familiar home behind us. "In having somewhere, and most importantly, someone to come home to when your world collapses." I blinked back, tears resting my head gently against his shoulder as we continued to rock softly in the darkness, the familiar creaking of the swing, a comforting rhythm. The future remained uncertain, filled with potential challenges. Mark would need to painstakingly rebuild his life, secure his apartment, potentially face professional and social fallout from the abruptly cancelled wedding and Sarah's smear campaign. There would undoubtedly be difficult days, even difficult months ahead. But here in this quiet moment, we had already found something incredibly precious and valuable in the wreckage of what might have been a second chance at the loving relationship Sarah had so nearly destroyed, a journey home, for a son who had for a time lost his way. The phone call that had changed everything that morning had done more than just save Mark from a disastrous, fraudulent marriage. It had, in a profound way, restored a mother and son to each other, a reunion far more meaningful and enduring than any wedding ceremony could ever have been. As the first hesitant stars appeared in the darkening sky above us, I made a silent promise to myself and to Bob's memory. This time, with this second chance, I would make absolutely sure that Mark understood his true, enduring inheritance, not simply a house to be sold or equity to be liquidated, but the rich, intangible legacy of being loved unconditionally, completely accepted exactly as he was, flaws and all. That I knew was a wealth no one could ever manipulate, exploit, or take away from him. The peaceful sanctuary Mark and I found that evening on the porch swing proved to be merely the calm eye of a much larger storm. The week that followed brought a whirlwind of complications, difficult confrontations, and unexpected revelations that tested our newly restored relationship, pushing us closer together, even as external pressures mounted. The first significant challenge arrived the very next morning. Mark had just come downstairs, drawn by the comforting aroma of pancakes, another cherished childhood comfort food, when his phone rang. The screen displayed the name of his law firm, and his face tightened visibly with apprehension. "Hello," he answered, his professional voice settling into place automatically, despite his obvious internal tension. I busied myself at the stove, flipping pancakes, trying to give him some privacy, while remaining close enough to offer support if needed. The one-sided conversation I overheard was deeply troubling. "Yes, I understand. Of course it's unexpected. No, I honestly don't think that's fair at all. I see. May I at least come into the office to discuss this matter in person? I appreciate that, Gerald. Thank you for your time." When he hung up the phone, Mark stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen, his expression utterly shell-shocked, looking pale and shaken. "What happened, sweetheart?" I asked gently, turning off the burner and moving quickly to his side, reaching out to touch his arm. That was Gerald Hoffman. Mark said, his voice sounding distant, detached, as if the news hadn't quite registered. "He's the senior partner at the firm." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Sarah's father called him directly last night." My stomach tightened instantly, with a growing sense of foreboding, anticipating the worst. "Apparently," Mark continued bitterly, "the Bradford family is one of the firm's most significant and influential clients. Something Sarah conveniently never once mentioned to me during our entire relationship." "What did they say to you, Mark?" I asked, my voice quiet with concern. "They are formally requesting that I take an immediate leave of absence," Mark said, recounting the humiliating request, "until, and I quote, this unfortunate personal situation resolves itself and blows over." The bitterness and self-mockery in his laugh held absolutely no humor. "In other words, Mom, I'm effectively being sidelined, put on ice professionally, until the Bradfords decide whether or not they are pulling their substantial business from the firm. My current cases and clients will be immediately reassigned to other associates." I guided him gently to a chair at the kitchen table, setting a warm mug of coffee before him. "Can they actually do that, Mark? It seems incredibly unfair, unjustly punitive." "They can do whatever they want, Mom," Mark said, staring into the dark depths of his coffee cup, as if it might contain answers to his predicament. "I'm not technically being fired, at least not yet anyway, but I'm effectively being professionally suspended. My career is suddenly in serious jeopardy. Because you refused to marry a woman who lied to you and tried to exploit you." That's absolutely absurd, a perversion of justice. Mark took a slow sip of the hot coffee, grimacing slightly at its bitterness. Office politics and professional pressures rarely align with simple fairness or morality, Mom, he said resignedly, especially when millions of dollars in potential client billings are at stake and influential families are involved. Watching his shoulders slump under the weight of this new blow, my protective instincts surged again, fierce and immediate. You need to seek legal advice of your own, Mark. This feels strongly like professional retaliation based on personal matters. From a purely legal perspective, they are technically within their rights as my employer, given the potential client implications. But Gerald at least agreed to meet with me in person tomorrow morning, Mark said, attempting a weak, hopeful smile. Maybe I can salvage something from the professional wreckage Sarah has left behind in her wake. That afternoon, while Mark, accompanied by Andy, went to his apartment with the locksmith to secure his home by changing the locks and retrieve essential belongings and documents, I received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang just after 2:00 p.m., and when I opened the door, I found myself facing a slender woman in her early 30s. Her auburn hair neatly pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression a mixture of nervousness and determined resolve. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Rebecca Martin. She extended her hand tentatively, looking slightly unsure of her reception. I genuinely hope it's okay that I came by. I wanted to check on how Mark is doing after yesterday, and to offer you my personal apologies face to face. I invited her inside without hesitation, studying the woman whose phone call had so dramatically changed the course of our lives. In person, Rebecca projected a quiet sense of confidence, though it was tinged with obvious regret and residual fear. As we settled in the living room with cups of tea, she seemed unable to meet my eyes directly for very long. I should have come forward with everything much, much sooner. She began her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her teacup, her voice soft but firm. Long before things ever reached this devastating point. If I had just spoken up months ago, Mark might have been spared such public humiliation and pain. You spoke up when it truly mattered most, I assured her, trying to offer comfort and perspective. That took significant courage, Rebecca. Rebecca shook her head humbly. Not courage, Mrs. Sullivan, just belated conscience. I was complicit in Sarah's cruel schemes for far too long, making excuses for her behavior, deliberately looking the other way, convincing myself it wasn't my responsibility. By the time I finally realized just how destructive and ruthless she truly was, she already had considerable leverage over me, both professionally and personally. It was difficult, almost impossible to break free of her influence. As Rebecca shared more details about her troubled history with Sarah, a disturbing and chilling pattern emerged, confirming my fears. Sarah Bradford was far more calculated, far more manipulative, and far more dangerous than even the initial evidence had suggested. She deliberately cultivated relationships with people she could use, maintained extensive and detailed documentation on potential targets and their families, and often employed a network of compliant associates, just as Rebecca had once been, to help execute her complex destructive schemes. It's not just about the financial exploitation, Mrs. Sullivan, Rebecca explained, her voice hardening with disgust. Sarah genuinely enjoys the power, the control, the act of manipulating others. Breaking apart family bonds, destroying trust between loved ones seems to give her a particular perverse satisfaction. She fundamentally sees love, loyalty, and genuine connection not as strengths to be cherished, but as weaknesses to be exploited for her own gain. How did you finally manage to break free of her influence and control? I asked, wanting to understand her journey. Rebecca's expression darkened her gaze, becoming distant as she recalled the painful memory. Her previous fiancé, Daniel. After she expertly engineered their breakup and emotionally devastated him, he attempted suicide. I was the one who found him, thankfully, before it was too late. She swallowed hard, her voice thick with emotion. Somehow, seeing the direct, devastating consequence of her actions, that was my wake-up call. I finally realized I simply couldn't participate, not even passively, in destroying people's lives anymore. I couldn't stand by and watch. The revelation hung heavy in the air between us, a somber reminder of the potential depth of the tragedy Mark had narrowly escaped. Not just financial ruin and public embarrassment, but potentially devastating emotional and psychological trauma. "Have you spoken with the other families, Michael's and Daniel's?" I asked, hoping they had found some closure or support. Rebecca nodded slowly. "Yes, I have been trying my best to make amends, to offer them whatever support and information I can. Michael has managed to rebuild his life, though his parents, unfortunately, had to sell their cherished cabin to cover the debts incurred. Daniel..." She hesitated, her voice filled with sadness. "Daniel is still really struggling. The shame, the betrayal, it was overwhelming for him. He moved back in with his mother and rarely leaves the house now." Before we could continue our conversation, the front door opened, and Mark appeared, carrying several suitcases filled with clothes and essentials retrieved from his apartment. His eyes widened slightly in surprise and confusion at the sight of Rebecca sitting in our living room. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" She stood up, looking slightly awkward and hesitant. "I wanted to see how you were holding up after yesterday, Mark, and to warn you. Sarah isn't likely to simply disappear or walk away from this. Based on her past patterns, she will absolutely try to retaliate against you somehow, to discredit you." Mark set down his bags with a weary sigh, exhaustion etched on his face. "She already has," he said resignedly. "I've been effectively suspended from my firm because of her father's influence and their business with us. That's likely just the beginning." "Mark," Rebecca said grimly, her expression serious. "Check your social media accounts, your email. She'll be working aggressively to control the narrative to shape public perception." Mark pulled out his phone, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through notifications. His face paled visibly as he read the content. "She's already posted on every platform: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook." He said, his voice tight with disbelief and rising anger. "She's claiming I had a mental breakdown at the wedding, that she is praying for my recovery, and publicly supporting me during this difficult time." He continued reading, his expression hardening into a mask of controlled fury. "She is strongly implying, without saying it outright, that I have been struggling with substance abuse issues that I deliberately kept hidden from her and everyone else." "Classic Sarah," Rebecca said, shaking her head in grim recognition. "She's expertly positioning herself as the concerned, supportive partner, the victim of your supposed illness, while simultaneously working to completely destroy your reputation and credibility. There's more," Mark said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Emails sent to my colleagues, clients I've worked with for years, even old college friends, all expressing her deep concern about my increasingly erratic and unstable behavior leading up to the wedding." I moved to his side, reading over his shoulder, my stomach twisting with disgust. The messages were masterfully crafted, subtly compassionate on the surface, but expertly planting devastating seeds of doubt and suspicion about Mark's mental stability and professional competence in the minds of those who knew him. "She's trying to ensure that when you finally decide to tell the truth about why you called off the wedding, about her deception. No one will believe you," Rebecca explained, confirming my fears. "She's systematically undermining your credibility before you can even begin to damage hers." Mark sank onto the couch, momentarily overwhelmed by the scale of this new assault, this calculated smear campaign. How do I even begin to fight this, Mom? If I try to defend myself against these wild accusations, I'll inevitably look defensive, unstable, exactly as she's portraying me. If I say nothing, her malicious narrative becomes the accepted reality." Rebecca sat beside him, her expression serious but filled with a quiet, determined resolve. "You fight it with the truth, Mark," she said firmly. "With documentation, with witnesses, the very same evidence that convinced you of her deception. You have proof, undeniable facts on your side." She paused, looking directly at him. "And you are absolutely not alone in this fight. I've been in contact with Michael and Daniel over the past few months. They're both willing to come forward now, to corroborate her pattern, to share their own devastating experiences publicly, if necessary. The possibility of having allies other victims who understood exactly what Mark was experiencing, who could validate his story, visibly strengthened his resolve. We need a strategy." He said, a spark of his professional confidence and analytical mind, returning cutting through the emotional turmoil. Careful, measured responses, legal considerations, damage control. We need to present a unified front. As Mark and Rebecca began earnestly discussing potential options and approaches, I quietly slipped into the kitchen to give them the space and privacy they needed to plan. Through the doorway, I watched my son, less than 48 hours removed from the devastation of his canceled wedding, already finding the strength and clarity of mind to face this new, daunting challenge. His posture had straightened, his voice had grown more assured, filled with a sense of purpose as he and Rebecca outlined potential strategies and next steps. The doorbell rang again, interrupting their intense planning session. When I opened it, Andy stood on the porch carrying several more boxes of Mark's belongings, his face etched with a troubled expression. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You really need to see this right away." He handed me a copy of the local newspaper folded open to the society page. The page featured a large glossy photograph of Mark and Sarah from their engagement party, smiling and seemingly happy beneath a headline that made my blood run cold with fury. "Architect's meltdown derails. Society wedding, family concerns about mental health." It's in the online edition too, Andy said grimly, stating the obvious. Comments are already flooding in. People claiming they always noticed something off or unusual about Mark, others expressing overwhelming sympathy for poor Sarah and her family. I carried the newspaper back into the living room, handing it to Mark, whose face hardened with controlled anger as he read the article. It was clearly sourced exclusively from the Bradford family and their PR representatives, meticulously portraying Mark as mentally unstable and erratic, and Sarah as the concerned, supportive fiancé, blindsided by his alleged breakdown. Your firm's managing partner, Gerald Hoffman, is quoted in the article. I noted, pointing to a specific paragraph where Mr. Hoffman expressed support for Mark during this difficult personal time and mentioned his leave of absence to focus on health concerns. The article concluded with a statement supposedly from Mark himself, carefully crafted words he had absolutely never spoken, expressing regret for any embarrassment caused to the Bradford family and asking for privacy during this challenging personal time. They are directly quoting me without my knowledge or authorization, Mark said incredulously, his voice filled with outrage. That is blatant libel. I never said any of this, not a single word." Rebecca's expression was grim but completely unsurprised. "Sarah likely convinced the reporter that she had your full permission to speak on your behalf, or that you were simply too unwell to comment yourself. She's done this before Mrs. Sullivan spoken for her ex-fiancé in the press, expertly controlled the public narrative to make herself look like the victim, and them look unstable or culpable." Mark stood up from the couch, pacing the living room, with renewed energy and determination, the shock replaced by a fierce resolve. "This ends now," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I will not be painted as mentally unstable or a substance-addicted pariah to protect Sarah Bradford's reputation and her family's business interests. I won't allow it." "What exactly are you going to do, Mark?" I asked, feeling a mix of concern for the battle ahead and immense pride in his unwavering determination. He turned to Rebecca, his eyes blazing with a fierce light. "You said Michael and Daniel would be willing to come forward to share their own devastating experiences with Sarah publicly." She nodded, her own resolve mirroring his. "They're ready, Mark. They've been waiting for someone who would finally stand up to her publicly, someone brave enough to expose her. Then we counter her lies with the absolute truth, not just my truth, but our collective truth, the truth of all the victims she has preyed upon." He said, his eyes holding a steel I hadn't seen since Bob was alive, a shared determination. No more victims staying silent out of shame and embarrassment while she targets someone new. We expose her pattern. As evening approached, our modest living room transformed into an impromptu war room, buzzing with activity and strategic planning. Andy arrived with his laptop, offering his valuable media connections and public relations expertise from his job. Beatrice arrived with a comforting home-cooked dinner and her invaluable practical perspective and calm presence. Rebecca coordinated video calls with Michael and Daniel, who joined our planning session remotely. Two men whose lives had been profoundly upended and damaged by the very same woman who had so nearly destroyed Mark's. Watching these strangers united by their shared trauma and their resolve to prevent it from happening to others rally around my son, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, deep gratitude for their willingness to support him, fierce rage at what Sarah had done to all of them, and a profound sense of pride in Mark's unwavering refusal to be silenced, shamed, or defeated. When the intensive planning session finally wound down well after midnight, our kitchen table was covered with handwritten notes, complex timelines, and detailed strategy documents. Mark, with Andy's help, had drafted a powerful public statement outlining the truth of the situation. He had scheduled urgent meetings with the senior partners at his firm, and he had coordinated with Michael and Daniel to release their simultaneous accounts of Sarah's consistent destructive pattern of behavior, synchronizing their efforts for maximum impact. It is almost certainly going to get worse, much worse, before it has any chance of getting better. Rebecca warned Mark quietly, as everyone prepared to leave for the night. "Sarah will escalate her attacks. She will fight back fiercely when she realizes you are actively fighting back against her." Mark nodded, exhaustion clearly evident in the lines of his face, but his determination remained unshakable, undiminished. "Let her," he said, his voice firm. "I'm completely done being manipulated by her, or by the fear of what other people might think or say." After our guests had departed and we were alone again, Mark helped me clear away the dinner dishes, moving through the familiar kitchen with the ease of ingrained muscle memory and unconscious comfort in the familiar surroundings. "I am so incredibly sorry that all of this chaos and difficulty has landed in your home, Mom," he said quietly, his voice filled with remorse. I never ever meant to bring such disruption and pain into your life. I rinsed a plate under the warm running water, choosing my words carefully, wanting him to understand. Do you remember, Mark, what your father always used to say about storms in life? A faint, tired smile touched Mark's lips, a hint of recognition. That it's not about avoiding them completely because they are inevitable, he said, recalling Bob's wisdom, but about having a safe harbor, a secure place to return to when they eventually hit. Exactly, sweetheart, I said, reaching out to squeeze his hand still damp from the dishwater. That's what home is, Mark. It's not just a physical building, though I am certainly incredibly glad I didn't sell it now. But it is also, and more importantly, a place where you are loved unconditionally, completely accepted, especially during the storms of life. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I heard Mark in the guest room, now his temporary room, speaking quietly on the phone. His voice, though low, drifted through the hallway, resolute and clear. I understand your concerns completely, Gerald, he said, firmly addressing the senior partner from his firm, but I will absolutely not participate in perpetuating a convenient fiction about my mental health or creating a false narrative simply to protect Sarah Bradford's reputation or her family's business relationship with the firm. No, I am not being vindictive in any way. I am simply stating the truth. Yes, I have compelling documentation of everything I am alleging, evidence that supports my claims. I genuinely appreciate the firm's difficult position in this matter, but my professional reputation, which I have worked my entire life to build, is at stake here, and I will not allow it to be unfairly destroyed. I will see you tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. sharp. As his call ended the silence in the house settling once more, I silently thanked Rebecca again for her immense courage and integrity in making that fateful phone call on the morning of the wedding. Without her timely intervention, Mark might now be married to a woman who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end, another conquest, in a calculated pattern of exploitation and deception. The road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, paved with challenges. Sarah's malicious smear campaign was already gaining traction, fueled by gossip and speculation. The Bradford family's influence extended deep into the social and professional circles Mark relied upon. His career hung precariously in the balance. Yet somehow, watching my son face these daunting challenges with newfound clarity, strength, and unwavering resolve, I felt more hopeful than I had in many, many months. In the crucible of this painful experience, Mark had rediscovered something essential about himself, a core strength of character, a commitment to standing in his truth, a profound recognition of what truly mattered in life. As I drifted towards sleep, I realized that in attempting to utterly destroy him, Sarah may have inadvertently helped Mark become more fully himself than he had been in years, reconnected to his core values, his true friends, his loving family, and perhaps most importantly, to his own authentic voice and sense of self-worth. Tomorrow would inevitably bring new battles, new difficulties, but tonight my son was home, standing in his truth, and that, for now, was victory enough. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, autumn had settled gently over my garden, painting the leaves in warm hues of amber gold and crimson. Mark and I sat together on the porch swing, sharing morning coffee, the air crisp and cool. Sometimes it honestly feels like that whole period was another lifetime ago, Mark remarked, watching a red leaf drift down from the maple tree. Other times, like it all just happened yesterday, raw and fresh. So much had changed since that chaotic wedding day. After Sarah's successful smear campaign, and the Bradford family's pressure ultimately cost him his position at the prestigious firm. Mark had made a conscious decision to redirect his architectural skills and passion towards meaningful community-focused projects, specifically designing affordable housing developments. The work paid significantly less than his previous corporate job, but it fulfilled him in deep, meaningful ways that his former career never truly had. Rebecca was now leading a successful support group for victims of relationship fraud and financial manipulation, using her own painful experience to help others heal. Sarah had quietly left the city shortly after her father's firm came under investigation. Her fate unclear, but her destructive influence finally removed from our lives. "Mom, we got it." Mark burst through the front door that afternoon, waving a stack of official approval documents with unbridled excitement. Full funding secured and immediate timeline approval for the Elm Street Community Housing Project. We can finally start breaking ground next month. That weekend, our backyard was filled with people who had helped Mark navigate the storm and begin to rebuild his life. Rebecca, who had bravely initiated the chain of events. Michael and Daniel, who had stood by him and shared their stories. Andy, his loyal best man and steadfast friend. Beatrice, my wise and supportive friend. And Emma, a kind and intelligent urban planner from his new project, whose friendship with Mark was cautiously, beautifully blossoming into something more. As the golden light filtered through the changing leaves overhead, casting dappled patterns on the ground, Mark raised his glass in a toast. "To unexpected journeys," he said, his voice filled with sincerity and gratitude, looking around at the faces of those gathered, to the seemingly small phone calls that have the power to change absolutely everything, and most of all, to the incredible people who remind us who we truly are, deep down, when we have somehow forgotten our way. The extravagant wedding he had been excluded from, the symbol of a life he had been pressured to chase, had never taken place. Instead, something far more profound, more resilient, and infinitely more meaningful had emerged from its ashes, a journey of painful reconnection, hard-won redemption, and powerful renewal. Up next, right on your screen, you've got 2 more standout stories that are just as compelling and moving. If this one truly hit the mark for you and resonated with your heart, you absolutely won't want to pass these others up. Just click and check them out. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads from us. Your support means the world.